Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Ridenauer, and we have another really good show today. It's been easy to crank out these shows and get into research for all of the snow here in Pittsburgh. I know this is something I bring up all the time, but it has been absolutely coming down and pouring down in snow, I should say, in Pennsylvania. I'm personally tired of it. I just want to see some sun and a nice blue sky here and there, and not just a white sky and white snow and no sunlight. But hopefully as we get closer to baseball season, the weather will break. I believe this is a big thing throughout the entire center part of America. I guess there's this huge ice storm that's been going through the area. I have no idea. But again, hopefully we can get some nicer weather because, like I said, baseball season is right around the corner. So I want to get into today's show, speaking of baseball, and we've got an incredible one, to say the least. I'll get back into another division prediction as we get closer to the season and all sorts of other topics, but I'll first get right into it, I should say, with the news and discuss any and all of the latest developments in the MLB world and share any news in the free agency market that's been going on over the last few days and really just touch on the latest developments in the MLB world. And then later on, I'll get into a ranking of the top shortstops in baseball right now, and really in the last few years, I should say, and share who I think is at the top of their game at that position. And then afterwards, I'll get into another division prediction in the MLB, this time of the AL Central, and share who I think will finish where amid the Central. And then, folks, be sure to stick around for the final few minutes of the show today, as I'll share a few hot takes I have for this upcoming season for both some teams and some players. So don't want to miss that one. It's going to be a really, really fun show today. But diving into this first segment, first things first, I want to get into probably one of the more, I would say, headlining moves in the recent free agency frenzy over the last few days, I should say, as the Dodgers have re-signed third baseman Justin Turner to a 2-year, $34 million deal. Now, Turner, I'm sure we all know, has made an incredible impact with this Dodgers team since he joined them in 2014. But the biggest holdup with his contract was that he wanted to make sure that it was a contract that's going to at least carry him through the rest of his career. You know, he probably has about 3 to 4 good years left in him. So I believe this is a 2-year deal. There's an option for the third year, if I'm not mistaken. So he could potentially play another year into maybe his 39th, 40th year, but who knows? I mean, that's going to be a bit of a stretch. I mean, he has produced very well, though, into his 30s, so I wouldn't put it past him. I mean, we've seen a lot of kind of cases where athletes, and especially baseball players, they're able to play well into their 30s and sometimes even into their 40s. And so Turner might be kind of those interesting cases, if you will. So we'll have to see how he kind of continues to progress this season and next season as well. But he's been, like I mentioned, on a roll with the Dodgers since they added him back in 2014 after the Mets cut him. He's been batting since then, .302 with the Dodgers, 116 home runs in total, so not too shabby. And not to mention, they've been to the playoffs at, I believe, every single season that he's been in LA, and not to mention, they also won a World Series, so let's not forget that, and they went to 3 World Series in 4 years with him there, too. Now, his defense and his mobility, clearly not what they once were, right? I mean, he's 36, he's going to be 37, so he's definitely not as mobile of a third baseman as he once was, but again, instrumental piece to this Dodgers team. And really, a lot of the guys had even mentioned after the World Series, Mookie Betts, I believe, was interviewed and was saying how Justin Turner was really the heart and soul of that Dodgers team. He was the heartbeat of that team. And if anybody really represents the Dodger blue well, it's Justin Turner. And just a couple fun facts about Justin Turner and actually how well he's been producing the last few years in particular. He's batted above 300 in 3 of the last 4 seasons, and his average has not dipped below 270 since 2012. So the guy has been a consistent, solid hitter each and every single season for the last 8 years. He was an All-Star one season in 2017, but he's only 2 years removed from having his career high in home runs of 27. So if your career high in home runs is coming when you're mid-30s, imagine what you can do in your late 30s. I'm sure he can still be very productive and still be a very, very big piece of this Dodgers team. He's also an incredibly patient hitter, and what team would want to pass up on that, right? This is a guy that he hasn't struck out more than 90 times in the last 4 years, having at least 400 plate appearances in each of those seasons as well. Now, we're subtracting the pandemic-filled season, of course, because there was only 60 games, but not striking out 90 times or more, again, keeping it on 90 and less, and in at least 400 plate appearances each and every single season, that's a pretty solid, I would say, batter, if you ask me. A great patient hitter, somebody that's going to get on base for you no matter what. And he's a very cerebral baseball player, and that really, I think, speaks volume to his ability as a hitter to be patient at the plate. He's able to pick up on certain pitchers. He's able to see things a little bit better. And what team would not want to bring him back, especially if you're the Dodgers, and especially when they haven't made any other moves. They haven't really made any other sort of, I would say, kind of advancements towards any other third baseman. It was kind of like, all right, when's this waiting game going to be over? I saw a bunch of things where the Brewers were in conversation with him. There was a lot of teams that were going after him because there's a lot of teams that need third basemen in the MLB. But the Dodgers, I think they were all they all were aware that he was going to re-sign with them. It was just a matter of how long he wanted to be there and then how much money he wanted to pay them. But very important is that, he's not going to be remembered, I think, for the very, very, very last thing in his Dodgers career when he found out he was positive for COVID. He had to leave the dugout, and he came back out onto the field after they won the World Series. Not a great image to be remembered about, so good thing that he's going to be coming back for another 2 years and going to probably make even more memories, I would imagine, and really allow people that are Dodgers fans to remember Justin Turner for all the great things and not really remember him for those kind of few blemishes. I mean, he hasn't really had many in his career, right? He's been I would say, a really solid guy all in all, Class A act, a great person on and off the field, very active in the community. So having Justin Turner back in LA, I think that's going to do wonders for the Dodgers. So getting into the next one, another team in the same division, the Padres, have also made a couple decent moves recently, adding to their pitching, as if they haven't added enough to their pitching already. I mean, we saw back in December what they were doing. But then they went out and got a former Pirates reliever, Keone Kela, and the deal has not been finalized quite yet. But having Kela in that bullpen, and then they also added Mark Melancon. So actually, two former Pirates relievers coming back, well, not coming back, but joining forces and coming back together in San Diego, and just a totally different team. So this Padres team continues to make move after move after move, and I'm really, for the most part, impressive with how aggressive but how consistent they've been about getting players and building this team. I mean, it's starting to get to the point where it's like, where are the weaknesses in this team? Mark Melancon, a former All-Star closer, somebody that's going to be at least, semi-productive. He brings a winning experience. He was with the Yankees when they won in 2009. He was with the Braves last year. So somebody that's going to bring a lot of experience to, I would say, a team that doesn't have a whole lot of experience but has a ton of talent. And they've done a nice job, the Padres front office has done a nice job at least, of surrounding this young talent with other veteran and experienced talent that have been at the top of their game, first and foremost with the starting pitching, what they've gone out and done. Then you also have to look at the relief pitching, so on and so forth. Now, getting into Melancon and Kela a little bit. Kela has been a little injury-ridden over the last few years, but when he's healthy, he's a really hard guy to hit. I mean, he's a great, great thrower. I mean, throws a lot of speed. He's got great velocity on his fastball, righty, coming out of the pen. I think a lot of teams probably would have been very happy to have him because if you look at his career numbers, I mean, in 2019, he pitched in 32 games. He had a 2.1 ERA. And then in 2018, in 54 games, he had a 3.2 ERA. And then in 2017, he had a 2.7 ERA in 39 games. So when you think about it, a relief pitcher is not going to necessarily pitch in every single game. He's not going to be called upon in every single situation to come out. So when Kela was being called upon, he was pretty, I would say, immaculate. I mean, he was pretty solid across the board, staying well below 3.5, 4 ERA as a reliever. That's where you want to be. That's the general area that you want to be in. And like I mentioned, Melancon's a former All-Star who spent some time on winning ball clubs, so he brings some experience winning later into October, and the Padres are definitely looking for that on their team with all of the young talent they have. Kela does have a little bit of a temper. I mean, he had a couple run-ins in the locker room in Pittsburgh, I believe, with Kyle Crick. He and Kyle Crick never really got along well. So that might be something to watch, just kind of see how he meshes with this new team. But I think he's going to do just fine. I believe in Texas, when he had a couple of years there, I believe that was kind of a thing with him, was that he didn't really have a great attitude, and it kind of carried over into Pittsburgh. But he might be coming into probably the best situation he's been in his entire career, coming on a team that is, in my opinion, the front runners, or at least two or the three front runners, or one of the top teams going into this season, and he's going to be on them. So I'm really excited to see how Kela does, but also how Melanson fares on San Diego and how they do out west, especially in that really good NL West with having to deal with the Dodgers. And I can't believe I'm getting into this next team. This is the next team that I want to talk about. I'm very shocked. I'm continuing to bring them up. I mean, this has to be the second or third straight episode that I've brought them up. And before that, I had not really mentioned them at all. And I would say that, for the most part, it's because they've been quiet. But recently, they made a better move, a solid move. The Mariners, they recently brought in James Paxton for the second time in his career now on an $8.5 million deal with some incentives that could drive the price up to about $10 million or so. Paxton is a huge get for them because, I mean, he's had some of his best years in Seattle. So that's the one thing that really kind of tipped me off, was that his career years, some of his best baseball was played in Seattle. So there is a great familiarity. I talk about familiarity a lot on this show because players and teams and coaches and really anybody in society, they're going to probably lean towards something that is familiar to them. And when James Paxton goes back to a place where he has fond memories of playing well, then he's going to probably be very excited and, as a result, probably play well and be enthused to play well. Now, he is coming off a pretty tough season with New York, but before this year, his ERA was never higher than a 3.9 in the 7 years he'd pitched. So as a starter, especially on this Mariners team that has very, very, I would say, thin starting pitching. Now, they're young. That's another thing. You bring in James Paxton, he would probably be the oldest, if not the second oldest pitcher on the starting rotation. There's only two pitchers from last year outside of the age of 27 in the starting rotation. Everyone else is 27 and younger. So right there, that does tell me that there's a lot of learning and growing on this team, not only with the pitching, but just overall with the personnel they have. You look at Evan White, first-round draft pick a couple years ago over at first base. You've got Kyle Lewis, who was, if I'm not mistaken, the AL Rookie of the Year this past year, and probably one of the best up-and-coming rookies in all of baseball. This is a team that I think needs some sort of collective or some sort of driving force that brings them all together, the glue guy, the guy that's able to bring them all together. And I think that's James Paxton. Obviously, this isn't going to take them to the playoffs. They maybe will have 80 wins this year. They might have a pretty decent season in their kind of standard, but I think overall it's not going to really do anything. But I think they will catch some eyes knowing that, okay, James Paxton is there, so they do have some life. They might be able to rely a little bit on, that pitching. They just didn't have a real veteran in this group, and I think having James Paxton out there is going to be really, really good for them. Now, it will be hard for these young arms to be ready, and also to, ready to go and ready to rock for a 162-game season, because if you think about it, a lot of these guys, this might have been their first or second year in the majors, and they've never really been experienced to playing in an entire 162-game season, starting almost 30 to 40 games as a pitcher. So having Paxton there to kind of show them the ropes and, tutor them a little bit, but also give solid production, I think that that's going to be a big break for them ultimately. And I think the Mariners were wise to go and get him. So some really good moves across the board. But the final thing I want to get into is critiquing MLB.com a little bit about an article that came out that was very interesting. And it was all about which player on each team, the writers and really everyone else, should be excited to see play the most this year. So the writers chose one player on each team, and I want to highlight which of the players they selected I agree with and which I don't really agree with at all, because there were a couple that I was, a little head-scratching, if you will. Not saying that some of these were way off the path, but I think that there were a couple that I wouldn't say that I would totally agree with. So I want to get into the ones that I agree with. The first one, and this is what the writers, I thought, really hit the nail on the head with, was the Royals. They want to see Carlos Santana play. And I think that, and they say in the article, it's going to, and it probably has so far, has gone down as one of the most underrated moves in all of the offseason. And I agree. I mean, Santana, when you think about it, did not have a great season in Cleveland last year. The year before that, though, he actually had a career season, if I'm not mistaken, and he was an all-star that season as well. So, and I've talked about these guys from this 2019 year where they had incredible seasons. And who knows, they might have been on the verge of having, monumental ascensions in their career and in their play if 2020 had not been a pandemic-filled season and if they were able to play the entire 162-game season. We might have seen guys that had that 2019 year be able to build off of it in full. Instead, we only saw a fraction of what they could do, and also the season didn't start till July. So that is another big thing. So I think Santana going to the Royals, that's definitely the guy I would pick to kind of see, especially, in that AL Central division. I would love to see how he kind of fits with this Royals team because not to mention, he clearly would have been one of their best power hitters this year. I believe he would have been at least top 3, if not their number 1 home run hitter, and probably top 3 in RBIs as well if he had played on the Royals this year. So bringing that much power, bringing that much offensive production, I definitely think that Santana is the guy to watch on this Royals team. So another player, I think this is a very obvious one. I mean, who would not want to watch him on this new team? Francisco Lindor on the Mets. This has got to be one of the biggest moves of the offseason and one of the most polarizing moves of the offseason. Bring in Francisco Lindor, and we're going to talk about the best shortstops in baseball in this next segment here coming up in a bit. He's up there, way up there, and I mean way, way, way up there. You look at his numbers, he has led all of shortstops since 2016 in numerous hitting categories, extra base hits, total bases, home runs. He's a silver slugger. He's a gold glover. He can do it all, right? And so he's going to be somebody that I'm excited to watch because not only is this Mets team going to greatly benefit from him, but I'm also excited to see how he performs in the NL East this year with how good the NL East is, with all of the talent that they went out and got. So I'm excited to see him, so I do agree with that. The Pirates, they say Cabrian Hayes, and I agree. Cabrian Hayes, a lot of people actually, from the people that I've talked with around the city, they've all agreed that Cabrian Hayes could be actually not only one of the best third basemen in all of baseball eventually, he could be the franchise cornerstone in Pittsburgh. Think about that. When was the last time Pittsburgh had a player that everybody was, I mean, it hasn't been that long ago, but there were players that obviously I don't think panned out in the way that they wanted to, and then they leave and they have a much better career. That usually happens with Pittsburgh. But I think they might have struck gold with Cabrian Hayes. I think that he's going to be a really great player. He's already shown that in the little bit that we saw him last year. Great glove. I mean, an incredible glove. Quick glove transition. He moves really, really well laterally from left to right. And I was just, the entire time that I got to watch him play, it was probably only about a month's worth of baseball. But seeing him in that 15-game span, it was like, wow, this guy's going to be pretty good. Like, he's got a lot of potential. He's got a really high ceiling. So I definitely agree with MLB on that one. And then the last one, the Blue Jays and George Springer. I mean, that doesn't shock me, right? I mean, he was probably the biggest addition in the AL East this year, and bringing in Springer is going to do wonders for the Blue Jays. So I'm excited to see him play for sure. Now, a couple teams that I disagreed with them on who they're excited to see play. I'm going to mention the players that I would personally, want to see play, and the ones that I'm more intrigued by than the ones that they selected. So I'm going to first get into the Yankees. They selected Corey Kluber, and the reason why I don't like this is this. Corey Kluber has proven himself in previous years. He has proven himself to be a good pitcher. He showed that from 2014 to 2018. You win 2 Cy Youngs. You win at least 18 games for that 4 or 5 year stretch in the 4 of the 5 years or the 3 of the 4 years, whatever. So you had an incredibly high winning percentage, and you churn out 220-plus Ks from 2014 to 2018. So I'm not really concerned or trying to be impressed by Kluber. I'm more so intrigued to see Jameson Taillon play. That's the player I would pick because Taillon has not yet proven himself. He has also run into injury issues just like Corey Kluber has, but we know what Corey Kluber is capable of. We don't really know what Taillon is capable of. We haven't seen that yet. So that's who I'm really intrigued by and kind of curious of how they're going to do on their new team this year. Another player that they mentioned on the Reds, Eugenio Suarez. Yeah, I'm excited to see him play, but at the same time, I'm looking more to see, Nick Castellanos or Mike Moustakas. I'm looking to see those two guys, Jesse Winkler. I'm actually more excited to see somebody like Jesse Winkler play after the year he had last season. Came out really strong. He was a DH. How is he going to adjust to going back to the no DH rule in the NL? So that's going to be something to watch. But then also, I'm curious to see how Mike Moustakas does this season, because Moustakas, for that contract that he signed, he did not come anywhere close to the level of performance that he signed for. So I'm more intrigued and more excited to see Moustakas come back in a full entire season, playing not just 60 games, but 162 games. Sure, I'm excited to see Suarez play, but in all honesty, I think Suarez could eventually get traded by the trade deadline this year. I've seen a lot of different things in the MLB in previous months. I would not write that off completely quite yet. I really do think that he could get traded. But I would have to say I'm more excited to see somebody like Jesse Winkler or Mike Moustakas on the Reds. And then with the White Sox, Luis Robert, I mean, I'm excited to see him play, sure, but I'm more excited to see somebody like Yoan Moncada. I'm looking to see the guys that are going to have bounce-back seasons. Guys like Yoan Moncada, who did not bat well at all. I mean, he batted .315 in 2019, comes back in 2020, bats around .220, .230. So a giant, about 100 points that he shaved off on his batting average in a year. That's a lot to shave off. So I'm more excited to see how he comes back this year, bounces back, and has a little bit of a better season, and how he also fares with Tony La Russa as the manager now. So I wasn't completely sold on watching Luis Robert. I'm not saying he's bad. I've actually mentioned it before. I was not initially sold on him, and then he really started to prove himself, and I said, wow, he's a lot better than I initially thought. So I will admit that there, but I'm going to have to say that I'm more excited to see a guy like Yoan Moncada, even a guy like Jose Abreu. How are you going to defend your AL MVP award this year? How are you going to go out and fare against the AL Central? But assuming that there isn't any real big problems with COVID, I haven't seen anything initially, but I don't think there's going to be any realignment. So you can play all throughout the AL now. You can play anybody you want in your league. So I want to see how he does against other league opponents. That's what I'm also looking for. And then finally, they mentioned Joey Gallo for the Rangers. I want to see Chris Davis. I'm more excited to see how Chris Davis plays. They had actually mentioned that they're excited to see somebody like Elvis Andrus on the Athletics, and I'm shocked that they went with Joey Gallo with the Rangers, because I would have thought that I mean, personally, when I saw that trade, I'm thinking the Rangers win that, because Chris Davis, he doesn't really have to worry about playing in the field. And I think that's Andrus' problem, is that he's still a fielder, and his production hitting has gone down. He's getting older. He's not able to do that wear and tear on his body as much, I think, especially playing in the field and then having to hit. That's why Chris Davis, I think, is going to be more of a move that's going to pay off longer term and down the road more, because he can just DH. That's all he has to do. And then you pair him with Joey Gallo, and then they also went out and got David Dahl. I think that would be a kind of a fun, interesting three-man, hitting tandem, if you will, in Texas. I don't know if it will work. I don't know if it will be successful, but I'm more excited to see Chris Davis play, because he's been injury-ridden the last year or so. He's shown his ability as a hitter, clearly. I mean, hitting 3 straight years of 40-plus bombs, that's really hard to do. I think anybody who's played baseball in any capacity would agree with that. So I personally am ecstatic to see Chris Davis play. Not really that excited to see Joey Gallo play, but nonetheless, I like where they were going with some of them. Others, not so much. But I will say, there is a lot of players, more players that I am excited to watch play this year than players that I'm not excited to see play. There's a lot of guys on new teams that I am thrilled to see how they do and how their team also does with that new addition. So, folks, that's going to do it for us in this first segment, but don't go anywhere, because when I get back from the commercial break, I'll share my ranking of the top shortstops in the MLB and mention which ones I think are at the top of the MLB in their respective position. Folks, stay right there. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA, to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer with you all, and in our first segment, I got into the recent news and developments going around the MLB and the league and touching on any recent signings. But folks, make sure you stick around for the final few minutes of the show today as I'll get into some of my hot takes for the 2021 season and share some wild and crazy predictions I have for the upcoming year. I want to now get into a ranking of the top shortstops in the league and discuss some of their career accolades and just them as players overall and kind of go through a ranking of them. I only picked out 7. I didn't go through a top 10 because I figured I don't want to put anybody to sleep, so I figured I would do just a top 7. And so I'll run through them 7 through 1. Coming in at number 7, Gliber Torres, a 2-time All-Star in the last 3 years, and he's only been in the MLB the last 3 years. Right there, I think that should tell you a lot about Gliber Torres as a shortstop. He's quickly emerged as a very, very good player, a pretty solid replacement so far for Derek Jeter. I don't want to jump to any conclusions right now because Derek Jeter left some huge shoes behind. So Torres has got to be, he's going to have to really, 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 elevate his game in the next couple years, take them to a World Series, whatever, if he even wants to be in any sort of conversation with Derek Jeter. Now, overall, Torres has batted pretty well, I would say, for the most part in his career. He's batted .270 and higher the first 2 seasons of his career. He belted 38 homers and 24 homers in 2019 and 2018, respectively. So right there, a 14 home run increase in just 1 year. And not to mention, 2018 was that first year he really saw major service time, and he already belted 24 homers that year. I think that should tell you a lot of things. Right there, that definitely does tell me he has one thing that Derek Jeter did not, and that's home run potential. And I think that's a very constant theme nowadays. And we're going to start seeing more and more shortstops being more and more lethal of hitters and more power hitting oriented, I would say, as opposed to slap hitting as they've been in the past. He's also never had a season below 100 in OPS plus, so backing up that claim of good power numbers. I think he's capable of being, a top-tier shortstop eventually when it's all said and done, being one of the top 2 or 3 guys in the MLB. I don't think he's quite there yet, but he's definitely knocking on the door, and somebody's going to eventually answer for him. So coming in at number 6, recently signed to the Toronto Blue Jays, Marcus Simeon. Simeon is, I think, riding one of the biggest momentum waves after a huge 2019 year where he finished 3rd in MVP voting. Now, 2020 was not a very forgiving year for him, I would say. His numbers really saw a step back. But again, I mentioned it in the first segment, and I mention it all the time because it's this weird phenomenon that I have started to realize. There's all these players that had career years in 2019, and none of them could live up to it in 2020 just about. So again, I think that speaks volume to, A, not being completely prepared because of all of the uncertainty with the virus, the season not starting until the middle of July, and there was only 60 games. So there was not a whole lot of time to make up a 10-game slump that you go in, or a 7 or 8 game slump even at that you go in, because those 7 or 8 games, you're going to have to play that much better for the next 52, 53 games, if you do play those full 52, 53 games, in order to even find yourself in any conversation of hitting well. So, again, the room for error this year was very, very small, and I don't think Simeon obviously took advantage of that. So, 2020 was not a great year, but 2019, that was a great season. Not to mention what I really like about certain baseball players is their durability. Can you play an entire season? In the last 3 seasons, he's only missed a total of 13 games. 3 seasons. Last 3 seasons, he's only missed 13 games in total. That is pretty impressive, especially for a guy that's going to be playing 162 games. And let me tell you what, you look at some of his game logs, he's playing 158, 162 games in an entire season. That is a grueling, grueling summer to go through. And not many players usually are able to play that full scale of a season. So you really have to give a lot of respect towards Marcus Simeon. I think the Blue Jays got him on a steal. a 1-year deal, $18 million. I think that if he wound up on another team, an even bigger contending team, like, let's say, the Padres, if they needed a shortstop, or a team even like, I don't know, the Yankees, if they didn't have Gliber Torres there, he probably would have been given a lot more money. But he winds up on the Blue Jays. They do pay him a decent amount, but like I was listening to Pardon the Interruption the other day, Michael Wilbon, he made a great point. $17 million, $18 million, that's not a whole lot in professional sports anymore. It's not like the 80s and the 90s when if you made 18 or 20 million, you were the top of the top in the tax bracket in that respective professional league. Nowadays, 17, 18 million, that's, kind of middle of the road. I would say you're you're right in the midst of everybody else. I wouldn't say that you stick out amongst anyone else. So I think that they got him on a steal. And like I said, that 2019 year I think is something to really, I don't want to say hold him accountable for going into this year, but really kind of, I would say, gauging him off of, because I think that is right there, the beginning of the peak of Marcus Simeon that we're going to start seeing. And I think we're going to start seeing an even sharper peak and an even, I would say, steeper climb up, ascending upwards for his, play, his performance this year. Not only that, he's going to be on a team that's going to get a lot of airtime, so he's going to be more in the media than he has in the past, with him coming from Oakland, so not a huge market. Him being in Toronto with all of the offseason news circulating around them with George Springer and whatnot, it's going to bring attention on to Marcus Simeon, so he'll be able to be seen more. And yes, again, his numbers did dip down, but look at his WAR numbers. That's another thing that I'll mention before I get into my top 5. His WAR numbers are staggering. From 2018 to 2019, they jumped up about double, just about double. Not quite, but just about. 4.7 in a WAR in 2018 to 8.9 in 2019. And if I'm not mistaken, that was one of the top WARs in all of baseball that season. So a great fielder with a great bat. I think he's going to make this Blue Jays team very happy. And as a result, I definitely could see them finishing within the top 2 of the division, if not winning the whole thing. So getting into number 5, Carlos Correa. I mean, how could you not, right? Another big-time power-hitting shortstop, and really we're starting to get into the real serious power-hitting shortstops here in this top 4, top 5, top 3. Former All-Star, former Rookie of the Year, and like I mentioned, he's got a lot of pop. I mean, you look at his numbers, and his OPS ones especially, his OPS numbers have been above 900 in 2 of the last 4 years, and then they've been above 800 in 4 of the 6 seasons that he's played. He can clearly hit for power. I mean, before 2020, he had at least 20 home runs in every single season except for 2018. So 20-plus homers, an 8 to 900 OPS as a shortstop in the first 6 years of baseball, just about. We'll just kind of average it all out in kind of a proximity, if you will. That's pretty impressive. That's some solid numbers to put up. And if you have a shortstop that's putting up 500-plus slugging numbers in 2015, 2017, and 2019, I mean, that's why I think this, Astros team has been so dominant in the past. And really, in that 2015 to 2018, 2019 range, you had guys that could hit anywhere. And you had middle infielders like Correa and Altuve, who both could hit with a lot of power. And that is kind of where we're starting to see, I think, again, it's been a very quick increase in the amount of guys that hit for power at the shortstop position. I would personally say guys that, obviously you can go back in the history books and really look at a lot of the big-time power-hitting shortstops, but just thinking in kind of the last 20 years, guys that I feel, I don't want to say set the precedent, but kind of set the bar, if you will, and also was kind of right in that same time frame in which baseball started to change and become more power-oriented as opposed to more small ball-oriented, getting a guy on, getting the pitcher up, moving him over, kind of that whole ordeal. Ian Desmond's a guy that I always look to as one of the first, at least in the last 15 years or so, one of the first true power-hitting shortstops in baseball. And then all of a sudden, you saw a little bit of an increase in that, right? You saw guys like Troy Tulowitzki. He started to really ascend through and become a big-time power-hitting shortstop. But you look at guys like Brandon Crawford, he's not a big power-hitting shortstop, I would say. I would not think of him as and you look at guys like maybe even Colton Wong. I know Colton Wong kind of floats around the infield, but we'll say he's a shortstop. He's another guy that is not a big power-hitting guy. So that's why I think Tulowitzki, Desmond, they were kind of the first guys, at least in the last 10, 15 years that I can personally think of, that really were the first ones, the forefront of this huge trend that we've seen in power-hitting shortstops. I mean, the amount that there are now is drastically different than there was 15, 20 years ago. And we have to remind ourselves, baseball went through this change of style of play not that long ago. So this is more of a new fad, if you will, kind of a more present, modern-day spin on the shortstop position. Now, where Correa needs to improve is his fielding. And it has improved. It has definitely improved, but it's still a part of his game that I think in some regards is lacking. I mean, the first couple seasons, he had upwards of 13 errors. He had 13 errors, I believe, in his first year, and then he had 14 errors in his second year. So then you look at that, and then in 2017, he goes down to 9 errors after that career high in errors in 2016 at 14, and then in 2018 goes to 6. And then in 2019, it went all the way down to 2 errors. So in about a 4 years, we'll say, span, you cut down that number of errors by 12 in a whole year. That's a pretty good improvement. I mean, a shortstop I don't think should ever be committing more than, especially at the MLB level, and if you're a starting shortstop, I would not think that you should commit any more than 15 to 20 errors. I mean, that would be max. That would be max, because shortstops do get a lot of reps. They do get a lot of, I would say, action, because they're in the middle of the field, so they're in a very popular area for a lot of hitters to hit. But at the same time, as a result, you can give them a little wiggle room, because they're probably getting hundreds of chances at ground balls as opposed to maybe a first baseman might be. So as a result, there is a little bit of leeway if there's maybe 8 to 10 errors. But once you get in the 14, 15 range, that's when you're like, okay, you might need to start working on this a little bit. But again, he improved it. It got a lot better. Now, he only played in 75 games at short in 2019. So he played in some of the fewest games that he's played in a season at shortstop in 2019, where he only had 2 errors. So is that a test to the lack of reps he got at shortstop, that he didn't really have to worry about that part of his game, that flaw in his game being shown? Or did he actually improve and he actually got better at fielding? Who knows? We'll have to see. But I think that, even though he had a down year this past season, this is going to be a big year for him. I think that he's aware of that. I mean, he had a pretty solid playoffs. He was pretty big for the Astros in the ALCS at certain points. I mean, he had a game-winning home run that extended the series for them. So I think that he's got a lot of potential, and he's going to be a free agent after this year. So just imagine how much. I mean, we had a lot of different news and things circulating around this offseason. Imagine next offseason. We're going to have guys like Trevor Story, who I'm about to talk about in a second here. You'll have Carlos Correa. You're going to have guys like Javi Baez. You're going to have all of these top-tier shortstops that they're going to be free agents. They could be on totally different teams. And if I'm not mistaken, Fernando Tatis will be a free agent in a couple years. So then that will be a whole nother kind of ordeal. But I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves. Carlos Correa coming in at number 5 in my shortstops ranking. Coming in at number 4, like I said, Trevor Story, another, like I said, soon-to-be free agent. This guy is incredibly vital to the Rockies. I mean, now that Nolan Arenado's not there anymore, everything I think is literally hanging on Story and Blackmon being, effective at the plate. And Charlie Blackmon came out to an incredible start last year. Now, clearly, he cooled off significantly after everybody was saying, well, is he going to hit above 400? How is that going to look in the record books? I remember even talking about that myself. Wound up hitting about 303 on the season, so a huge drop-off. But Trevor Story, he has been on an absolute tear in the last couple of seasons. He batted 285 and higher in each of the last 3 seasons. So 2018, 19, and 2020, he's batted above 285 in each of those 3 years. And he's also been a major home run hitter. 2018, he knocked in 30-plus bombs. 2019, knocked in 30-plus bombs. And in both of those years, he knocked in over 80 RBIs. 2019 was that year that he really, I think, saw the largest level of success. I mean, he batted 294, 35 homers, 85 RBIs, and then he had 108 RBIs the year before that. So this is a slugger that I think is going to see, again, a lot of publicity around him this year going into next offseason because of him being a free agent, but also what he brings to the table, right? I mean, his slugging percentage has been above 500 in 4 of the last 5 seasons that he's played in. So if you've got a guy that's putting up that caliber of numbers, again, I just talked about Carlos Correa, and we're starting to get into the big power-hitting shortstops. And if his numbers amazed you, Trevor Story's have probably made your jaw hit the floor by now. I mean, the guy has got a ton of potential. Now, here's the caveat. Just like Correa with the fielding, Story has his own flaws, and that's striking out. He's had major issues in the past with that. Led the MLB in Ks in 2017, and he's had he's had a very high amount of Ks over his career. I mean, he's had as high as 180 Ks in a season. He's had at least 130 between 2016 and 2019 in each season. So I think that he's actually a big MVP caliber player. I think that he's got that potential about him. Look at Marcus Simeon. In 2019, he put up identical numbers to what Story put up just about, and he was 3rd in the MVP. I feel like Story can be an MVP caliber player. I definitely think that. If you've got a guy at shortstop that's hitting, again, 30-plus bombs, batting above 285, and he's got 80-plus RBIs, That sounds like an MVP to me. Now, I know he's not on a great team, and that does hurt him a little bit, but I think ultimately Story has to be at some point given a little bit more respect, and I hope that after this upcoming season, he can put together a big show and he can wind up on a contending team, which I feel is where he should wind up on. Now, getting into number 3, Javi Baez. I mean, this is a shortstop that personally for me, I'm looking to see have a real big bounce back year. I mean, he batted terrible last year. 203. He played in 59 of the 60 games, so it wasn't like there was any issues with him with COVID or lack of reps or lack of time at the plate, whatever. He played in every single game except for one, and he still batted 203. And the year before, he batted 281, and in 2018, he batted 290. So a big-time drop-off from the last 2 years. But again, similar story to the last two guys. A lot of power in his swing. And it's, like I keep saying, it's going to become more and more of a trend in the position. And we're starting to see that now, as I mentioned these guys. I mean, he belted 29 homers in 2019, and he had 34 homers in 2018. And then he had 111 RBIs, which was an NL high in 2018. How many guys do you know of that have been at the shortstop position in the last 25 years and that have led the MLB in RBIs and had over 100 of them? Not to mention had over 30 home runs in a season. Can't be many. There can't be that many. He's a two-time All-Star. He's a solid Gold Glove winning award winner also, which he won actually in 2020. So although he did not have a great year hitting-wise, he still made up for it in the field, and somehow, some way, the Cubs still found themselves in the playoffs. But he also had a streak of at least 2 WAR in each season from 2016 to 2019, with 2019 being the highest at 6. So I think that this is a big turnaround year for him. I think that he can really bounce back after a terrible season in 2020. Because, again, if you've got a guy that's able to hit that many home runs, and he's your middle infielder, I mean, and he's probably going to be hitting in the third, maybe second hole. I mean, imagine what you've got through the 4 through 6 hole hitters and what kind of power you've got there. So it's just more power in more places throughout the lineup. So getting into my top 2, coming in at number 2, Fernando Tatis. And I know that might seem a little shocking that I put him all the way up here, but with the little time that we've seen him, and again, I say little in kind of an ironic way, because if you think about it, he played 84 games in 2019, played about 50, 60 games in 2020, and then he played playoff games. So he played I would say just shy of 80 games this past year. So he's actually just right around a full year in terms of games logged in his career so far. And he's put on such a show that it's kind of hard to ignore. I mean, he's got a smooth swing, a very quick swing with a lot of power, and he's also a pretty solid fielder. He's coming off a season where, like I said, he exploded onto the scene in the beginning, kind of started to plateau a little bit and go down, wound up finishing at a 277 clip with 17 homers and 43 RBIs. Not to mention he was on one of the best teams in baseball and one of the top 3 hitting teams in baseball. And those two hitting numbers right there, 17 homers and 43 RBIs, I would definitely say are 2 of the big reasons why the Padres had so much success last year. Now, his WAR has never been below 2, and with him being, under the age of 23, 21, 22 years old, this makes his potential so much higher than I think a lot of these other guys on this list, because he's got that much more room to grow and continue to improve. This is going to be a big year for him because this is a full season. How is he going to play in a full 162-game season? How is his stamina going to be? Are we going to see fatigue set in? Are we going to kind of see, he's not ready quite yet to put together a full season? Could we see the same thing we saw last year? Comes out really strong, plays really well, makes an all-star team maybe, and then the second half he just completely fizzles out. Could we potentially see that? I don't know. I don't want to jump to that conclusion quite yet, but when you've got a guy that's playing his 3rd year now technically, and he has yet to play 100 games in a season, it does make you wonder if he's going to be ready come August or even late July. If he's going to be playing April 1, April, May, June, that's 3 months. That's not even to the All-Star game yet. So could we see him actually start to drop off before the All-Star game? I don't want to jump, again, I don't want to jump too far ahead of myself, so I'm not going to speculate too soon, but I do fear that if fatigue sets in, lack of stamina sets in, then we might see him kind of do the same thing this year, and if he doesn't come out to the strong start he did in 2020, then 2021 might not be as good of a year for Tatis, but at the same time, he's got so much potential that it's hard to ignore. So he's coming in at number 2. And then number 1, I think that he's easily the best shortstop in the game, Francisco Lindor. There's no question about it, right? The guy can do everything. 4-time All-Star, 2-time Gold Glove winner, 2-time Silver Slugger. This was his worst year that he's batted in his entire career. His batting average has never dipped below 270 for an average before this season. That's incredible. This was the first year in his 6-7 years that he's played in the MLB that his average has not been 270 or higher. And he's also been a consistent 500 and above slugger. He's done it 3 of the last 6 years. So another guy that's very durable with how many reps he also gets at the bat or at the plate, and how he's led the MLB actually, or the AL. He's led the AL or the MLB in plate appearances for a season in 3 of the last 4 seasons. So that's, again, another thing to kind of make note of. He does a great job at staying healthy. As a result, more opportunities to get more hits, to make your stats look that much better. And if you can stay that healthy and you can be conditioned that much where you're not getting, you're not losing a whole week because of an ankle injury or losing 2 weeks because of a hamstring pull, if you can stay that healthy and you can stay that durable the entire the way, then there's no question you're going to be, and if you've got any sort of skill or talent, there's no question you're going to be one of the top players in your position. And that's why I think Lindor's up there. All in all, I think that there are some guys on this list that, probably could have been moved around a little bit. I don't think you can really dethrone Lindor from his number 1 seat, though. He's pretty good. And I'm personally excited to see him play in New York this year. We're going to see a lot of him on TV because their team's going to be on TV constantly. So we're going to be very exposed to Lindor. And I'm excited to just see how he does not only in a bigger market, how he does on this new team, but then also how does he do in the NL? He's never been in the NL. He's never really faced NL pitching. He's never really gone up against NL East pitching either for a guy that's always been in the AL. So could that be a little bit of an adjustment? I don't think so personally, because the one guy I would be fearful of in that division, Jacob deGrom, happens to be on his team. So he's not going to have to run into him. So all in all, a lot of great shortstops. Like I mentioned, there were a couple that probably just missed the cut. If I was doing a top 10, I probably would have thrown in guys like Colton Wong per se. I'm trying to think of some other guys. Maybe Chris Taylor. I don't know. There's a couple guys I was kind of wavering back and forth with on whether or not I should put them in there. But those would be my top 7 or so in the league. But, hey, you know what? I think all in all of them are great, and a lot of them are very young, so we're going to get very used to a lot of these great shortstops in these coming years. So, folks, that's going to close it out here for us in our second segment on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. Coming up after the commercial, I want to get into yet again another division prediction, and this time give a prediction of the AL Central and who I could see finishing atop the leaderboard in the division. Folks, it's been a ton of fun so far, but we've got a lot more to go, so don't change that channel. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Great to have you all here still with me today. Jack Ridenauer again. In the last segment, I jumped into ranking the top shortstops in the game right now, but I want to now get into kind of another ranking, but more so of a prediction of the AL Central and discuss which teams I see finishing where and who I could see being in first place this season. Now, there are a lot of teams in this division that I think could, make some subtle moves. We might see one team make a move forward one place. We'll maybe see a team make one move backwards. I don't think we're going to see any major leapfrogging. We're not going to see a team go from fourth to all the way to first place. There wasn't that big of a drastic change, I think, for a lot of these teams on their respective rosters. So I'm going to go from number 5 all the way to number 1, obviously. Coming in at number 5, I don't think this should be a shock for anybody, the Detroit Tigers, right? I don't think I have a whole lot of hope for them this year at all. They had the second worst record in the AL last season. They finished dead last in the Central, and they don't really have any pieces, I think, that they can use to make a decent run towards the playoffs. They don't have anybody on their team, I think. Now, maybe Heimer Candelario, he would be the one that I would potentially see as a piece they could definitely build around for the future. I mean, Miguel Cabrera is old. He's on his last leg of his career. He's still been productive, sure, but he hasn't really had to try real hard to be productive. They've had some of the worst outfield hitting in baseball, especially last year. I mean, Daz Cameron in right, he batted 193, and then Christian Stewart in left batted 167. Jacoby Jones was their other outfielder, and he was injured for half the year. So there's hitting in the outfield that's pretty much depleted from last season. And I think if they can get Jones back, if they can maybe pull out an extra year or two out of Jonathan Scoop, I think that Heimer Candelario is going to be the guy they build around for the future if they can keep him in Detroit and he doesn't have some sort of insane season and then he goes off into free agency down the road and then he's no longer a Detroit Tiger. And that's that. I think that they need to definitely act quickly, and I think that their first move of that is getting A.J. Hinch. I think Hinch was a wise hire for them at manager because he's had a lot of success in his career. Yes, it has kind of been overshadowed for a cheating scandal back in 2017 with the Astros, but they still won a World Series, so he's a World Series winning manager. He's also had experience with building a winning team and building a winning culture in a franchise that was struggling before. I mean, you look at the Astros before Hinch arrived, and then when he finally arrived, it's night and day. I mean, they were the laughingstock of the MLB when I was personally growing up. And in the last 6-7 years, they've all of a sudden turned that around into being one of the best teams in baseball. It's pretty much been at the snap of the fingers that there's been that kind of change. So I think the Tigers are smart to go in the direction of Hinch because that could definitely be the first kind of inkling and kind of the first, I would say, spark of this team eventually starting to really build up and really start to make some moves and start to build a winning team down the road. If they can figure out the outfield hitting, if Heimer Candelario can stick around because, I mean, he was their best hitter last year, batted a team-high 297, and he had the second most RBIs on the team behind Miguel Cabrera. So if you add some more hitting, and the pitching is, I mean, they've got a lot of pieces that they could use for the future, too. They've gone out and they've gotten some prospects, but there really is no major home run hitter either. So that's another thing. They didn't go out and get somebody like a Carlos Santana, kind of what the Royals did. Somebody that isn't going to necessarily be an MVP, but he's going to liven things up in that lineup a little bit. And the only major home run hitter was Cabrera. He was the only one with double-digit home runs, and he's 37 years old. So he's clearly not going to be sticking around for much longer. The Tigers, I think, are a few years away from really making a legitimate run towards the playoffs, but I think that Hinch might accelerate that prolonging into the playoffs for the Tigers because he does bring that mentality of, okay, let's just wipe the slate clean and let's start from scratch. And that's what I think he's doing right now. So this is going to be a big rebuild for them. I think this team kind of reminds me of the AL version of the Pittsburgh Pirates. So I do see them kind of going through a massive, massive turnover period right now for maybe 2 or 3 years down the road making the playoffs. So they're coming at number 5 for me. I'm going to say that the Indians are going to come in at number 4. This is a team that I don't think has one great strength or one great weakness. There really is kind of just, everything is kind of the same, if you will. I think the hitting is clearly not as strong as the pitching. I mean, the pitching was some of the top pitching in baseball last year, but their hitting was some of the worst in the AL. I mean, they finished at the bottom of the AL last year in home runs as a team and RBIs. They only had 59 homers as a whole in 2020. But they did have a top 10 ERA in the AL. They had the Cy Young runaway winner in Shane Bieber. So there is one pretty solid aspect of their team, and then there's the other aspect that's not so solid. So you've got two completely opposite ends of the spectrum for this Indians team, and I don't think they really have that nice balance. They don't have that piece that can kind of bring them all together. They finished third last year. It was a very tight race in the AL Central. They finished behind the White Sox and the Twins. But Jose Ramirez was the only main batter in the lineup, I would say, and the first two hitters in their lineup from last year batted below 200. So, and one of them is Carlos Santana. So he's not even on the team anymore. So you have to fill in that kind of void there also. But then you also lose Eddie Rosario. And I did not realize how big of a loss this was going to be. When you've got a guy that batted .287 in 2019, he had 72 RBIs. He did see a major drop-off in 2020, but he's got a lot of potential. He's batted above 30 home runs in a career, or in a season before in his career. So losing Rosario, that's big. Losing Santana, that's big. That's a lot of their hitting that's no longer there. And I think that, that's a huge piece, or excuse me, Ahmed Rosario, not Eddie Rosario, Ahmed Rosario. But you lose Ahmed Rosario, obviously somebody that is going to, or excuse me, you do get Ahmed Rosario. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place today. You do get Ahmed Rosario. You get him because you make that trade with Lindor, but Lindor is no longer there. Carlos Santana is no longer there. You still have most of the pitching, but Mike Clevenger is also not there. So there's more players that have left the team and have been traded away in the last year that have come back onto the team, or that have at least been added onto the team. And I think Rosario has potential. I think he saw a major drop-off in 2020, like I mentioned, 287 average, 72 RBIs. The other, I was thinking of Eddie Rosario, who's with the Twins, who I will talk about in a little bit. But sticking with Ahmed Rosario, he could be somebody that they could see as almost a future Francisco Lindor, who they might hope that, can turn into that caliber of a player. But I really don't know if that's going to happen, right? I really don't know if that's going to be, a major change for them. And now, like I said, Eddie Rosario is now with the Indians, I should say, formerly with the Twins. Now he's with the Indians. And I think that adding him, you added Ben Gamble for the outfield, so you actually did address a big issue that they had. They had one of the worst OPS outfields in all of baseball. They had one of the worst outfield OPSs in the entire league, not just the AL, but the entire MLB. So you go on and get a guy like Rosario who, he's batted above 270 from 2017 to 2019, saw a major jump in his numbers with 32 bombs and 109 RBIs. And 2 years prior, he had actually belted 20-plus homers in each of those 2 seasons. You get a guy like Ben Gamble, who's been a productive hitter for the Milwaukee Brewers in the past couple years. You go out and address that issue. So I will give them credit on that. They did figure out the outfield hitting, so maybe they'll be a little bit better. But Eddie Rosario, I think, does kind of bring some questionable kind of, he's not the most patient hitter, right? He's got a high strikeout rate. And you look at a guy like Lindor, who isn't as, big of a strike. He does strike out a little bit, but he doesn't have as big of a strikeout rate as Eddie Rosario does. And you're losing Lindor, right? And Ahmed Rosario, it's interesting. They kind of went out and got a guy like Eddie Rosario, who's going to bring a lot of hitting, just like Francisco Lindor did. And then they bring in Ahmed Rosario, who I think is going to be more of a glove kind of guy like Lindor. So they basically got rid of one guy, and they brought in 2 guys that do. One guy does one thing really well that Lindor does, and the other one does the other thing really well that Lindor does. So they kind of just went out and got, 2 separate Lindors, if you will, that only do, one of the 2 things that he can do very well. All in all, they're an interesting case. I don't see them really making a big playoff run. I think they suffered a lot of loss this offseason with losing Lindor, losing Santana. So I have them coming in 4th, but we'll have to see. We could be very wrong about that. Coming in at number 3, I've got the Kansas City Royals, and I know that they weren't good this past season, but they added so many pieces, and that's what's so intriguing to me. You go out and you re-sign Greg Holland. You pick up Carlos Santana. You trade for Andrew Benintendi. And I think that they could be a nice third-place team. They kind of give me this idea that very similar to the Athletics. They're not necessarily getting any superstar players. They're getting guys on a low payroll that they don't have to pay a lot, that have a lot of production ability, and they actually have a lot of, and I'm sure they're probably running all sorts of statistics and running all sorts of numbers, because I can just kind of tell that's how this team has been placed together this past offseason, with guys in certain parts of their lineup that need addressing, and other parts, Carlos Santana bringing in that power hitting. They had very little of it. They didn't actually, again, I mentioned this earlier in the show, Carlos Santana would have been, I believe, the leader in home runs for the Kansas City Royals this year, and he would have also finished within the top 2 in RBIs, or he would have been at least in the top 2 in both categories. So they don't really have a whole lot of power hitting, and they had the I would say a guy like Michael A. Taylor. He's going to go in and he's going to replace the, retired Alex Gordon, that glove, that defense that they're going to be missing. You go out and get Andrew Benintendi, kind of the same idea. And then you get in Greg Holland and Mike Minor, some veteran pitching that they can try and help out with this team that has a lot of potential pitching-wise. I mean, they had, guys that did not perform well, but I think that they've got guys that are going to be coming up through this farm system and really some solid prospects along the way. But again, their ERA was not great. They had the 6th highest team ERA in the AL. They were 12th in the AL in home runs, and they did belt, the 3rd most homers out of their division. And that was kind of, something that caught my eye personally. They were ahead of Detroit and Kansas City. So in terms of power production, but also giving up, power production, they weren't the greatest. But this team, they simply struggled with getting people on base. I mean, they had the 12th most walks in the AL and the 13th worst OBP in baseball as well. So this is a team that did not do very well in getting guys on base. And that's where Carlos Santana comes in again. Led the AL, or I believe at least the entire MLB, in walks last season. He's a high walk guy. This isn't the first time that he's done that. He's led the AL or the MLB in walks before for a season. So if you think about it, they brought back some pretty decent players, but then they've also got some pretty decent players. I've always been very high up on a guy like Whit Merrifield. I think he's one of the most underrated baseball players in baseball. He does a lot of good things for you. You can put him in the outfield. You can put him in the infield. He has a good bat. And I think between Merrifield, Salvador Perez, who I think is one of the top 2-3 catchers in baseball, and Maikel Franco, who's one of the most underrated third basemen, that's a pretty solid, 3 hitting tandem there. And now Franco's a free agent, and we don't know if he's going to be coming back. Again, Alex Gordon retiring in the, and really opening things up in the outfield. They went out and addressed that. But if they can get Franco to stick around in Kansas City, I think this Royals team is going to be very good, better than people might expect them to be. I actually saw something on MLB.com the other day, and they were talking about teams that they are going to be on the lookout for, and teams that made some of the best moves and some of the best but underrated moves in the offseason, and the Royals were on that list, and I completely agree. I mean, if you look at who they went out and got and how they addressed the issues that they have with the outfield, very similar to the Indians, right? I have to give the Indians credit. They went out, they got productive hitting in the outfield because that outfield hitting was terrible. The Royals, they've done that. They went out, they replaced, a really good defensive outfielder for another really good defensive outfielder. They go out and get some more power hitting because they really lacked there in that position, in that department. And they go out and get even more outfielding. And they bring somebody like Andrew Benintendi, who, again, he brings a little bit of both. He can hit and he can field. Michael A. Taylor can only really field, and Carlos Santana can only really hit. So Benintendi's a nice combo of both. So you get kind of the best of both worlds. And so I think that ultimately they're going to come in third. It might be a little bit of a stretch, but I definitely think that with the moves that they've made, they're definitely prepping themselves, I think, for something special down the road. Now, getting into my last two, coming in at number 2, the Minnesota Twins. This is a team that, honestly, I know I was very, I would say, outspoken about it. I was not impressed with them early on in the offseason. They didn't do anything. But then they slowly started to gain traction. They re-signed Nelson Cruz, picked up Andrelton Simmons. I think now you can maybe put them back in the conversation of contending for the division. I think you can definitely do that again. They needed to bring back Nelson Cruz. That was the first thing that I would have been shocked if they didn't, because Luis Arias, he's the only other guy in that lineup that batted above 300 this past year. Didn't have a great year from Jorge Polanco, who, when I go back to my shortstop rankings, he was another guy I kind of missed. But, he's kind of been up and down the past couple years. He's only had one really good year, 2018, 2019, one of those 2 years. But the Twins, getting back to them, they finished in first place last year in the division. And I just don't know if they have enough firepower to compete with the White Sox this year, because the White Sox are just so loaded. You go out and get a Hall of Fame manager in Tony La Russa, you go out and get some more pitching, that's going to be pretty hard for the Twins to compete with. I think that guys like Miguel Sano, Mitch Garver, Josh Donaldson, who all had really poor years last year, I think that they're prone and they're possibly on the verge of having bounce-back seasons, especially Donaldson. I've seen many, many things, a lot of reports that Donaldson seems to be back to, his normal self. He could be back to his MVP caliber, level of play. They did lose Eddie Rosario to, again, one of their cross-division rivals in the Indians. He was a consistent power-hitting guy, so that's going to be gone, and that's going to probably hurt that lineup, but that is why I think they needed to get Nelson Cruz, because with both of those guys out of the lineup, that would have been a very, very, very exploited lineup. And honestly, I don't know if I would have put the Twins in the top 3. I mean, that would have been a very interesting prediction if they had not re-signed Nelson Cruz, because they would have been really thin with the hitting. The pitching's also, I would say, thin in some regards. Kenta Maeda is really the main staple in that rotation, being the Cy Young finalist this past year, having a really good season, leading the MLB in WHIP. he was the main attraction. You got guys like Randy Dobnak, Jose Barrios, who I think that they can also be very good 2 to 3 starters in the rotation behind Maeda. And I think if they can get those 3 guys to all have really good years, and then you've got guys like Andrelton Simmons and Nelson Cruz carrying the load, and maybe you get guys like Miguel Sano and Josh Donaldson picking up the slack, then I think you can have a totally different conversation about this Twins team. I just think that they have a lot of talent that happens to underperform in the worst case or the worst possible situation, and I think that's what they've really been suffering from, is just that lack of performing at the right time. So I've got them coming in at number 2, but then finally, number 1, I think we all probably figured this was coming, the Chicago White Sox. I mean, this might be one of my favorite teams to win the AL this season. I've loved what they've done this entire year because, again, they've gone out and addressed things that they needed to address. The veteran pitching, or the lack thereof of it at that point. They also addressed the bullpen pitching. They didn't really mess with the hitting lineup as much, which they didn't need to. You add Lance Lynn, you add Liam Hendricks, and now they're starting to, I think, really assemble, I think, a World Series caliber team. This was the best home run hitting team in the AL a year ago. They had the second highest OPS plus as a team in the AL also, so clearly I think a lot of pitchers are going to be very, very afraid of this White Sox lineup because they've got a lot of guys that can hit. I mean, you look at guys like Jose Abreu, you've got guys like Tim Anderson, you've got guys like, I mean, they signed Adam Eaton over the offseason, Eloy Jimenez, Yohan Moncada, who, again, he didn't even have a good year last year. And I think that they were like a Moncada blowout year away from actually, getting past the Athletics and going into the playoffs, further into the playoffs. Moncada only batted about .225 last year, as opposed to .315 the year before. So just about 100 points, and I mentioned it in a previous segment, that's a huge, huge dip down. And when you've got that low of production, it makes everybody else on your team around you have to pick up the slack all the more. So it eases things up if you're able to go out and have that kind of level of production that other guys on the team have had, especially this past season. So I'm looking to see Moncada have a big bounce-back year. I just do also wonder if Tony La Russa's older style of managing is going to clash at all with this younger style of play, power hitting, driving in runs, getting guys moved over. Is that going to clash with how Tony La Russa goes about things, right? I don't think so because he has the DH now in the AL. He doesn't really have to worry about the pitcher. So I think that's going to eliminate that aspect of it. So ultimately, I think this White Sox team can go very far. I mean, I would not be shocked if they went to the ALCS this year. I really do believe that. And if they can get a good year out of Lynn, if guys can all hit and they stay healthy, and then Giolito and Keuchel can also perform, I mean, there's no reason why they shouldn't be the favorite in the AL. So we'll have to see. But again, White Sox, I've got them coming in at 1, Twins at 2, Royals at 3, Indians at 4, and then the Tigers rounding it out in the basement at number 5. So a very interesting division. I think that's going to still, again, be very top-heavy as it's been in the previous years. But it's only going to be top-heavy amongst, probably 2 teams. I would say the Royals are still not quite where the Twins and the White Sox are. And I'm sure the Indians will probably silence me very quickly because they did add some pretty good pieces. I mean, they did kind of take, like I said, Eddie Rosario off of the Twins lineup. And as a result, the Indians, now they have that better outfield hitting. But they did lose Carlos Santana. And they also lost Francisco Lindor. So those are 2 guys that you're going to have to really kind of, make up for, if you will, in the long run. But folks, that's going to do it for this segment. Thanks again for sticking around as always. Stay right there, though, because we'll be right back after this commercial break for the final segment today, where I'll get into some hot takes I have for the MLB season this year and some things I could see occurring for certain teams and players. Don't go anywhere, everyone, because we have one last segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup final.
Listen now.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for the final segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer still with you, and in the previous segment, I got into a prediction of the AL Central and shared who I think will finish where in the division. But for this segment, I just want to run through some interesting hot takes I have about this upcoming season that I think could maybe come true, but some of them are a little bit of a stretch, so I'll get into them and kind of, unpack a couple of them, but that's why they're hot takes, right? They're kind of a stretch. They're kind of a speculation, if you will. So the first one I want to discuss is, and I don't know if this is necessarily a hot take because I think a lot of people would agree with this. I personally think that the Padres are going to beat out the Dodgers for the NL West, even with the additions that the Dodgers have made. Now, I don't think that's going to necessarily do anything for the Dodgers making the playoffs because I think that they could still become a wild card team, and as a result, I think they'll still find themselves in the postseason. They'll still find themselves playing in October. But who's going to win the NL West this year? And that's the Padres. I really do believe that. Just look at the pieces that they've added. And look at here's the other thing, though. The Dodgers had a little bit of a head start. They didn't need to go out and make all of the drastic moves that the Padres did. The Padres were, I think, kind of culminating these moves over a period of time. They first get Manny Machado. Fernando Tatis starts to kind of explode onto the scene. Jake Cronenworth was a happy surprise as a rookie. You go out and get guys like, Will Hosmer, Will Myers, or Eric Hosmer, Will Myers. And now you've started to really build a nice team. Then you go out at the trade deadline. You have to go out and get a guy like Mitch Moreland, who, at the time looked great because he was hitting so well, but towards the end of the year, he didn't really do much. So I don't know if it's necessarily a move that is going to pay off for them in the long run. You got a guy like Austin Nola, though, behind the plate, and I think that's a move that could definitely pay off in the long run. So you do all of that in about minus the Manny Machado thing. You do that all in about a year, 2 years' time. The Dodgers haven't necessarily had to do that. They haven't had to go out. Now, they did go out and get a guy like Mookie Betts, but Cody Bellinger, Clayton Kershaw, all of these guys that were on the team before they went to the World Series with Mookie Betts, they haven't really had to go and deal with that headache of building a team and really having to assemble talent like that. So I think that's where the Dodgers, maybe they're starting to ease up. This is kind of the old rabbit versus the hare versus the tortoise race, and the rabbit kind of took his time, and then the tortoise eventually caught up. The Padres are kind of the tortoise. They're way behind right now, and I think the Dodgers are kind of taking their time, enjoying the beautiful weather, and enjoying this World Series win, and I don't think they realize that, this Padres team is right on their heels. Oh, and did I forget that they have Blake Snell and Yu Darvish as well, two guys that are Cy Young caliber pitchers on the same pitching staff, and acquired within about 2 weeks of each other. So, and not to mention, you also have Joe Musgrove, Dinelson Lammon, who also was another top-tier pitcher this past year. And when Mike Clevenger comes back, whenever that is, that's your fifth guy. So, you tell me, this team is ready for a major playoff run. I think that they are definitely suited for it. If not this year, 1,000% 2022. I think that this team, they've got so much talent that it would be incredibly aggravating. Just as a baseball watcher, as a baseball fan, as somebody that covers the sport, it would be incredibly infuriating to watch a team with this much power, and this much talent, not put it together and lose. That would be so demoralizing to watch. So I think the Padres, they are just too stacked to not make any sort of a run, make any sort of noise. So I've got them beating out the Dodgers for the NL West. Now another one that's kind of staying in that NL West area, Trevor Bauer. I don't think he's going to have a good year this year. I don't think he's going to be good with the Dodgers at all. I don't think he might have one good year in the 3 that he's there, but I do not see him having a good year this year. I personally think that he was, again, a beneficiary of a very shortened season. He was able to capitalize on that. He was able to play his best baseball he has played in his entire career up until this point in this shortened season, win a Cy Young, and be able to draw out this entire offseason where he's going to go and get whatever amount of money he wanted and land with the Dodgers. I know that there are local ties to him being from L.A., so that had a lot to do with it, and I know that the Angels were actually in the talks of getting him at one point or another, but I think just about every team was in the conversation for that at one point or another. And I think that Bauer is a guy that, again, it's kind of a facade. It's kind of fake, I think, because if you look at his career numbers, he's only had one other year besides this past year where his ERA was below 4, and he's played in 8 seasons. So not a very good amount of time that he's been in the league that he's been able to have, an ERA that reflects a solid preventing of runs that a pitcher should have, especially a starting pitcher, especially a guy that's starting 30, 35, 40 games in a season. He does have really high strikeout numbers, which does go well with this Dodgers team who, although they were first in team ERA and team wins last year, they were not that great in team Ks. And so that was something that I think they needed to kind of pick up on. And they go out and get a guy like Bauer. That's perfect because he was third in baseball last year in strikeouts. At the same time, if you want a guy that's going to prevent runs and limit the amount of runs being scored against your team, I don't know if Bauer's that guy, because in the past he's shown that he can get rocked, he can get lit up, and not to mention, he's got a little bit of an attitude. And we've seen that on and off the field. How is that going to affect his time with the Dodgers? I don't want to say a no-nonsense organization, but an organization that has a certain standard. They are championship-winning teams. They are a championship-winning culture, franchise, organization, whatever you want to call it. And I don't think Bauer can get away with what he's gotten away with in the past. And I don't know if maybe this is going to be a wake-up call. I don't know if they've had a conversation with him about it. I don't know if there's something in his contract that says it. But if you've got a guy that's going to be causing so much off-the-field issues and taking so much attention away from your team, and not to mention you have that worry of, okay, if things aren't going well for him, he could go on Twitter, he could lash out, say whatever, and then now we have to bring in public relations, and we've got to deal with all of this and all this negative publicity. How do we handle this? He did this, he did that, whatever. I do hope that Bauer has a good year. I just don't think that he's going to, because we've seen it in the past. Top-tier players from one year, they go and get a huge contract. The next year, they don't do much. It kind of fizzles out. It's very flat, right? It's almost like, okay, it kind of feels staged. Like, okay, he just had a really good year to make a lot of money. He put in his all that one season. It clicked, just so happened, and now he's kind of just riding a wave, and he's just kind of riding it out until he retires, and maybe he wins a World Series ring, and then he can just sit on the rest of his money for the rest of his life. So I don't mean to be so critical of Bauer, but he doesn't really give me this feeling that he's going to be a guy that is going to have a huge year from this year, but also be able to build off of this really good year he had last year, because he has set the bar alarmingly high. So he better bring it all for this upcoming season. So another kind of hot take I have, I mean, I've mentioned it before, I think the Royals they'll be the biggest surprise team this season, by far. I think that we'll be most surprised by the Kansas City Royals. I could maybe see the LA Angels being another kind of surprise team, but personally, I've got the Royals being the most surprising team. We saw it a little bit this past year. We saw teams like the Marlins. We saw teams like the Orioles for a little bit, the Tigers for a little bit. They were these surprising teams that were hanging in there in the playoff race at the beginning of the season and kind of in the middle. And for this past year, that was kind of a long period of time into the season, the middle of the season, and they were still hanging in there. They were in the playoff conversation. So I think that this Royals team could be this past year's Marlins team, where they make the playoffs. People are kind of confused as to how they did it, but they don't really go anywhere that far in the playoffs, but they do impress a lot of people, and people are then aware of, and hey, I think that this Royals team, they don't get the credit that they deserve, right? I mean, their front office has done an immaculate job of building a winning team. They've gone to the World Series with this, and they've won World Series with this kind of mentality of, we're going to start small, we're going to trade, and you can kind of tell when a team is making almost like a 3 to 5 year plan, when they one year make a bunch of moves. And it's these moves that kind of get them set up for the next year or two and get them on their feet. And then come year 2, year 3, maybe one of those two guys that they went out and got wind up getting traded after having maybe one good year, and then they can go out and get more pieces. And that's kind of how you build and trade up, and you kind of play this trading game, if you will. And I think the Royals are doing that right now. So they're going to be my personal surprise team for this season. I'll also say that the White Sox, I've got them winning the AL this year. I don't think that's really a hot take. I definitely think that a lot of people would probably agree with that, with just how good their team is. I'm just concerned, and I do wonder with having a guy like Tony La Russa there, if that's going to do anything with their chemistry, with just their game plan and everything, because I think the players might be on one page and La Russa might be on the other, and that could pose an issue. And it would be, again, all eyes would be on Chicago if things were not going very well because of La Russa being there and them being in Chicago and all of the offseason kind of build-up there is with this White Sox team. So I've got them winning the AL. A couple other shocks that I have. I've got Josh Bell being an MVP candidate this year. As crazy as that sounds. I really do. I believe that Josh Bell will be an MVP candidate this year because I think he's going to fall into the same mold that every other Pirates player does just about. You go and you're with the Pirates for 2 or 3 years. You don't really do a whole lot. You've got 1 or maybe 2 good years, and then you get traded or you leave because of free agency, whatever it might be. And then you go to another team, and all of a sudden you just see this epiphany almost, like a literal physical representation of an epiphany, and this player just is able to put it together and have an incredible turnaround and kind of change of events in their career. We've seen it with Garrett Cole. We've seen it with Austin Meadows. We've seen it with guys that have gone from the Pirates onto other teams, and they go out and have a lot of success. And so I think Josh Bell is going to fall in that same category. He's going to be on a team that, he's going to be a main piece of. After Juan Soto and Trey Turner, they're going to need to look to somebody else. And I don't know if Kyle Schwarber is that much of a reliable third option. I think in that situation, Bell might be the third, if not the second option in terms of power and the production that he can put up for this Nationals team. I mean, this team wants to score runs, and they want to drive in runs. And who better to do that than having Soto and Bell both on the same lineup? Not to mention you've got Schwarber, so you've got 3 guys that can really churn out some RBIs. So I think Josh Bell is going to have an MVP candidate season. I think I could see him, depending on how the Nationals do, hey, he could maybe even win it. Who knows? I wouldn't be shocked by that either. I really would not be shocked. I think we're going to see just about, here's another hot take that I'm going to just throw it out there because, again, it kind of relates right back to me since I'm here in Pittsburgh and I live here in Pittsburgh. I think just about every single former Pirates player that was on the team this past year that got traded or is on another team, so guys like Josh Bell or Joe Musgrove or Chris Archer, I think that they're going to have some of the best baseball that they've ever had in their entire careers. I really do believe that. There's just something about the Pirates. I don't know what it is. I wish I could figure it out, but I can't. But the last 2 I want to discuss, this might be a very early prediction, but I could see the Blue Jays going to the ALCS. I could see the Blue Jays and the White Sox facing off in the ALCS and the White Sox winning and going to the World Series. That's a very aggressive take because we have not even started baseball yet. But again, as a broadcast, journalist guy, sports guy, my job is to speculate, and so I am going to speculate. I think that with just the additions that the Blue Jays had this past offseason, the blowout years that they had from guys like Teoscar Hernandez a year ago, they've got arguably the best hitting outfield right now, not even with Teoscar Hernandez and Lourdes Gurriel and George Springer, but also Randall Grichuk. You've got a really good infield, right, with Marcus Simeon. You've got Kevin Biggio. You've got Vlad Jr., you've got Bo Bichette, you've got a lot of guys that are going to be really good, and they're young, and so you're going to have this core group of guys for a couple years, not to mention you've got Springer there for about 5, maybe it's 6, one of the 2, a long period of time. So as a result, I think that this Blue Jays team is, again, maybe this isn't the year that they go far, but I think 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road, we're going to have a totally different conversation about this Blue Jays team. We might start, teams might start shuddering in fear when they have to go up against the Blue Jays, and fans might be afraid of the Blue Jays. For the first time, I think, in my entire life, teams would be genuinely and fans would be genuinely concerned when their team would play the Blue Jays. I think that they could go to the ALCS this year. They've got the power, they've got the potential. I think the pitching would have to really get figured out. They did make some additions there. They did make some good moves. So, again, they kind of did a little bit of what the Royals did mixed with what the Padres did. And that's what intrigues me about them. They went out kind of like the Padres, made some big splashes like a George Springer. And then they did some kind of quiet, subtle moves, getting guys like Kirby Yates, and getting guys like Robbie Ray, kind of these off the beaten path, not the biggest name, but still really solid players that are now on their team. So I think it's a totally different ballgame. And then the final thing I want to touch on, that's my biggest hot take, is I think the Brewers and Cardinals will be the tightest playoff race in all of baseball for 1 and 2. I think it's either going to be the Cardinals or the Brewers winning that Central Division. The Cardinals, they've made the biggest addition in that NL Central, but then the Brewers made the second biggest, and they didn't really lose anybody. So that's another thing. Neither team really lost a whole lot, and one team made a bigger move than the other. Now, I will say the Cardinals did lose Colton Wong, but they replaced him with Nolan Arenado, which isn't a terrible replacement, obviously. So I think that the Brewers and Cardinals will be the tightest playoff race in all of baseball this year. Maybe the Padres and the Dodgers will be a close second, But teams like, the Blue Jays and the Yankees, I think there will be a little bit of separation, more than people think, because I'm just really, I'm very, skeptical of this Yankees rotation. I don't know what to think of it. I don't know what to think of Taillon yet. I really don't know what to think of Kluber. I have a better idea of what to think of Kluber, but Taillon, I have no idea. He's a wild card for me, so I have no idea what to think of him. So ultimately, I think there's a lot of different things that could happen this year. Just a couple hot takes I have. We'll have to see if they'll actually come to fruition, but if they do, well, you heard it here first on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. But folks, that is going to wrap it up for us here today. As always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice little review that really helps us out. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we would also really appreciate it. And as always, everybody, really enjoyed all of you joining the show today. And until next time, have a wonderful day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.